What makes you happy?
Be yourself, be positive. Just another mindset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Just Another Mindset podcast. We need a paradigm shift if it comes to our economic and social systems. Let us drive this change together. The Just Another Mindset podcast shares inspiration and tangible techniques on how to create seismic shifts in an outdated system, collectively and for individuals alike. My name is Ismail, and each week I bring to you a relevant conversation, message, or theme that will not only entertain you, but help you to change towards a more meaningful and satisfying life. Get encouraged by listening to successful thought leaders, inspiring individuals, and impressive changemakers. Change from within will last and create positive results for all of us. Let us get inspired and embrace collective changes for the better. In today's episode, I share a conversation with you that I had with Evan Mandery. Evan is the author of 8 books, including 4 novels, as well as the co-creator and executive producer of the TV series Artificial, for which he won Peabody and Emmy Awards in 2019. Evan is a professor at the City University of New York. For the past decade, he has been a leading opponent of legacy preference at elite colleges. His new book, Poison Ivy: How Elite Colleges Divide Us, is an eye-opening look at how America's elite colleges work hand in hand with suburbs to keep the rich rich. In this episode, you will learn about injustice and the inequality of the education system, particularly in the US. You will learn about so-called elite colleges and why they in fact increase inequality and segregation instead of fighting against it. Evan graduated from Harvard Law School himself, but he teaches at a public college, and he would not change anything about it. Today, you will learn why. We talk about how elite colleges and suburbs work together to exacerbate social inequality. The book reveals how tacit agreements between exclusive Ivy Plus schools and white affluent suburbs create widespread de facto segregation. You will also hear success stories of wonderful, hardworking people, most of which did not study at Ivy League universities. You will be confronted with the question whether or not you are ready to acknowledge your bubble and make first attempts to step out of it. Finally, we talk about positive changes, hope, and first contacts. And with that, Evan, a warm welcome to the Just Another Mindset podcast. And my first question today is, how do you feel and what is on your mind?
Today, thanks for having me. Today, I feel a sense of relief. Maybe it's fleeting, but I'm definitely in the camp of people who's very terrified about the direction of things in the United States, where I live, and the direction of things on the planet where we both live. And I thought yesterday was positive, or at least not the worst.
And you are, of course, referring to the midterms in the US, as we are recording one day after the elections, if I'm not mistaken.
You're correct. That's what I was thinking about, though. I'm also thinking about the climate change summit, and that could be going a little bit better.
Absolutely. I do agree to that. And let's see where our conversation will take us today, Evan. But one of the main reasons is that you also recently published a book, and this book is called Poison Ivy and How Elite Colleges Divide Us. But Evan, maybe before we go and talk a little bit more detail about the book, about the different stories from the book, maybe we can start off with, what are you passionate about?
Well, I'm passionate about lots of things. I would say when with my students, I do a value clarification exercise. I'm very passionate about being a father, and I'm passionate about being an educator. And I'm a particular fan of where I teach. I'm very lucky in that I love my job. I love teaching, and I love the institution that I'm associated with. And I think John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which is part of the City University of New York, is a great force for good. And I love teaching, and I love the mission of trying to create opportunity for people.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing that. And you have been a teacher and an educator there for more than 20 years. Has that been your first career, or how did you get to become an educator?
I've been a teacher in some sense since I was 17 years old. I have always found a way to be in a classroom, but I made my money for a while as a lawyer. I earned my living, and I liked some aspects of it, but I always thought that I would get back into a classroom full time, and I always wanted to be a writer. So I'm very blessed that I get the freedom to write about and explore whatever interests me.
And this is, if I'm not mistaken, in fact, your eighth book that you have published. And you earlier said that you have worked as a lawyer as well. So prior to your work as an educator, you have also graduated from Harvard College in 1989 and from Harvard Law School in 1992. And why that is relevant, or may be relevant, is in fact the name of the book, or the conversation that we may have on that. And this is Poison Ivy and How Elite Colleges Divide Us. And I would be very interested, Evan, what inspired you to write this particular book?
Well, the book is very much the product of my life experiences, probably almost from start to finish. My dad was a high school principal. He still works at the same high school where he was principal, which is also the same high school where he went as a student. And I've loved teaching since he first took me to class when I was 5 years old. So it's always been what's most fascinated me. And I think the diversity of my experiences, both as a student and a teacher, are what led me to write this book. I did go to Harvard as a student, and I taught there while I was in law school. For now nearly the past quarter century, I've been at CUNY. And I've spent a lot of that time thinking about what separated my life and the outcomes and life courses of the people with whom I lived at certain points from those of the students that I taught.
And you have already stated that there might be quite a significant difference between Harvard and the university where you are an educator today. Do you maybe want to share with us what makes an elite college, and what makes also maybe the institution that you are so proud about being a teacher so special for yourself?
Well, I would put air quotes or scare quotes around the word elite. I think that when most people in the United States talk about elite colleges, they're talking about colleges that are ranked highly in the U.S. News and World Report rankings, but I don't think that really has any relationship to what schools are the best. Certainly no relationship whatsoever to what schools educate their students the best. So I definitely am very interested in the status that's attached to these schools. I do acknowledge that these schools produce a certain type of economic consequences. They produce a certain economic outcome for their students. And what the Harvard and Yales and Princetons of the United States are principally doing is admitting a bunch of rich kids, and they're near perfect at preventing downward mobility. They're an insurance policy against downward mobility, and they're the exclusive promoters of access to a type of super elite job, like working for a management consulting firm like McKinsey or an investment bank like Goldman Sachs, and certain tech jobs and certain with respect to law school jobs at elite law firms. And so while the percentage of people who go to these schools may be small in some sense, their influence is great. And I think it's correct to talk about them.
And you already talked about downward mobility, Evan, and I would be very interested. What is class anxiety and why does it matter?
Barbara Ehrenreich talks about fear of falling, the social critic and documenter of working class life, Barbara Ehrenreich, and class anxiety is the desire to pass on one's status. It's more about status than wealth to their children, and for people who are either were born into the upper class or made it, they want their kids to be able to stay there. And I would argue that basically upper class white life in the United States is shaped largely, maybe almost exclusively, by this fear of falling.
So that upper class, and I hear white males, do not want to lose status, and that therefore they are intrigued or being made sure to go to one of those, in air quotes, elite colleges.
Well, they want their kids to go there. I mean, I think it's a different mechanism in preserving the status for yourself, but they're seeking out status for their children.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to read a quote here, and it says that the author, being yourself, reveals how tacit agreements between exclusive Ivy Plus schools and white affluent suburbs create widespread de facto segregation. And as a college degree continues to be the surest route to upward mobility, the inequality bred in our broken higher education system is now a principal driver of skyrocketing income inequality everywhere. So what is it that most people do not know about those elite colleges and that you want them to know, Evan?
Okay, so I think most people have a sense that income inequality in the United States is extreme, more extreme than it's been at almost any other point in US history, and more extreme than it is at almost any other place in the world. What some people have a sense of, but may not know quite so well, is that the United States is de facto segregated. We don't have legal segregation anymore in the United States, thanks to Brown versus Board of Education. But thanks to another Supreme Court decision called Milliken versus Bradley, we have de facto economic segregation. And that comes from local school boards' right to control tax policy and resource questions. So there are hundreds of borders in the United States where one school district has a poverty rate that's 20 points or more lower than its adjacent neighbor. And because there's so much variation, what the standard white life course is in America is to live in the city until you have children, and then either send your kids to private school or move to an affluent suburb. And what they're doing is chasing extra resources and access to extracurriculars and narratives that elite colleges choose to value. And the thing that I don't think most people focus on is that elite colleges are driving the train much more than they would admit. I mean, they would say they are the victims, or that they're reproducing underlying conditions of inequality in America, but to a much larger extent than they certainly would admit, they're actually the cause of inequality in America.
And what are reasons that make you say, or data that makes you say, that they are in fact the reason or the cause for this inequality, much rather that they follow this trend?
Well, I mean, it's, for example, the things that they choose to value. So why do elite colleges run sports programs or place value on, as came out in the Asian students lawsuit against Harvard, which the Supreme Court just heard oral arguments on last week, what they call distinguishing excellences, like science projects or participation in Model United Nations programs. None of these things, including SAT scores, have any demonstrated relationship to performance in college. The best predictor of performance in college is high school rank. So Harvard and Yale could admit a better prepared, more likely to succeed group of high school students if they just based admissions on high school rank, if they just chose among valedictorians and salutatorians. But they don't want to do that because that would upset their tacit agreements that they've had with private high schools like Groton and Andover and Exeter, from which they take 5 to 10 students every year. And it's an unspoken agreement that if you spend a tuition to get your money into these schools, that it'll give you a significant leg up in getting your kid into elite colleges.
So what if not the test scores in high school, I just want to call it, they value? What is it that elite colleges value instead? You mentioned sports, you mentioned different extracurricular activities, I'm just going to call it.
Well, about Harvard, and Harvard's actually at the low end of this. Harvard fills about a third of its class with athletes. They're called ALDC preferences: athletes, legacies, donors, and the children of faculty members. So they take about a third of their spots and reserve them for kids who play sports. And it's important to remember that those sports aren't equally accessible to all, not by a long shot. So in America, at least, most people only watch Division I college basketball or football on TV, and there's lots of Black participation in those sports. So people think they're an avenue of opportunity, but it's not true. Division III football and basketball, smaller schools that don't give athletic scholarships, are overwhelmingly white. And then Harvard, for example, runs 42 sports teams, including programs in lacrosse and squash and fencing and 2 skiing programs. And, most of my students have never even heard of many of these sports. So, does that make Harvard a better place, having a good downhill skiing team? It's preposterous. But all of these little buckets take away opportunity from socioeconomically disadvantaged students, or just from people who aren't super advantaged socioeconomically.
But that is, of course, not outspoken, right? If I understand correct, like to the outside, it still has the facade to be open and equal opportunity, while in fact, it is much more difficult for a working class child, even though he or she may have the very best scores and is a bright child, to access one of those so-called elite colleges. Is that correct?
Correct. If you're born into the top 1% of the income distribution in America, you have about a 1 in 4 chance of ending up at an elite college, and virtual certainty of ending up at a selective college. The only people who don't make it fall out for health reasons or because they choose to enter the workplace. Or if you're born into the bottom income quintile in the United States, which is around $20,000 a year, which is very, very little money, your chance of ending up at an elite college is less than 0.5%.
You said the top 1% in the US if it comes to income. Just to give us an idea, are there any numbers? What does that mean? How much income per year would that mean?
Top 1% in the United States right now is around $650,000 a year.
Which is quite privileged, let's just call it, or super rich.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for that elaboration, Evan. And I actually have another quote I want to use here, and it reads, "The Harvard Financial Aid Initiative and other programs like it are a central part of a story that elite colleges have long told. Given the existing inequality in America, elite colleges are a force for good. Almost every element of this story is a myth. Their core business isn't lifting poor kids out of poverty, it's keeping rich kids rich. And I would be interested if you can elaborate on how elite colleges in particular systematically keep the rich rich and the poor poor.
Well, our understanding of the economic function of elite colleges is immeasurably enriched by a study by the economists Raj Chetty of Harvard and John Friedman of Brown. Friedman is a character in my book. I interviewed him at length. And it's a study that's based on IRS records and school tax records. And here's a simple way of visualizing it. If you were at your 10th Princeton reunion, for every one kid in that room who was a poor kid, somebody from the bottom income quintile, who was promoted to reasonable affluence, the top income quintile, there would be 20 rich kids who remained rich. These elite colleges, statistically speaking, principal function is letting in rich kids and making them richer. Now, can I say one other thing on the quote you read? So, I mean, that quote, what I think is important about this to me is that's not the story that they told. So if Harvard and Yale and Princeton said, hey, look, we're not like profit maximizers exactly, but we're status aggrandizers. And we're in a race with each other to have $1 trillion endowment, which Harvard is on pace to have early in the 22nd century. Well, we would look at them and we wouldn't say that they were forces for good. Maybe we wouldn't either say they were forces for evil. We would just look at them like, most corporations. They're just kind of sort of profit maximizer. But that's not the story that they tell at all. The story that they tell is that they are promoters of opportunity. And in return for that, partly because of that story, they receive massive tax exemptions from the American government. One sociologist estimates that tax exemption to be worth cumulatively $20 billion a year, because contributions to endowment are tax exempt and endowment earnings are tax exempt. And most of these colleges don't pay real estate taxes on the property that they own, which is, of course, enormous because they're country clubs. So that's very damaging. And I think what's even more damaging is the narrative that they tell, because they don't say we let in the rich and the richest. They say we let in the best and the brightest. They say we let in the smartest, hardest working, and most deserving students. And the myth of meritocracy is a double-edged sword. So if Harvard says that we're admitting the hardest working and the most deserving and the brightest, by implication, they're saying the students I teach are less hardworking, less deserving, and less bright. And let me say, after nearly a quarter century teaching working class students, about 60% of CUNY students come from families making less than $30,000 a year. I've taught one rich student in my career, and basically every student that I've taught either works part-time or full-time. They're the hardest working young people I've ever seen in my life.
And for me, it sounds staggering that there is 20 billion of tax subsidies for those elite colleges, which also, I believe, have a different price tag than community colleges or non-private schools in the US. So I suppose they also make a little bit more revenue. Actually, I have some numbers which we can talk about in a bit later on. And when you are talking and you talk about the students that you teach at City University, New York, in preparation for this podcast, and you also mentioned it earlier, that if you have education from one of the top or from of the elite universities, you will also find those elite jobs, meaning investment banking, meaning management consulting. But do you have an idea? I don't know if there is some kind of number, but how many graduates of those elite colleges fight this inequality and fight this injustice, if this would be a distinguishing factor to be a good job? Is there any?
You mean how many people from CUNY end up working at Goldman Sachs or something like that?
Well, that would be a follow-up question. My first question would be from the elite universities. How many of those do actually not choose to work in investment banking or McKinsey, but choose to work in jobs that maybe your students are more likely to choose?
I can answer that question. We have data on that. So among Harvard students, because the Harvard Crimson, the school newspaper, surveys people, surveys seniors at graduation. So we actually get a sense about career choices. About 60% of Harvard graduates go into investment banking, management consulting, or the tech sector. It's a little different than when I went to college. When I went to college, the plurality choices were law and medicine. And medicine is a lucrative profession, but, you know, doctors are one version of do-gooders, right? How many go into teaching, for example? About 2% of Harvard students go into teaching. And almost all of those who do go to Teach for America, which is a 2-year program in the United States that was founded by a Princeton graduate and involves a 2-year commitment to working in schools. By contrast, at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, where I teach, about between 2/3 and 3/4 of our students go into public interest. You know, if you live in New York, or if you visit New York, do this sometime. Ask a cop or a firefighter where they went to college, and it's more likely than not that they're going to say they went to CUNY.
Interesting. So 2/3 to 3/4, you said, and I think vice versa. There is a very small amount of students from your school that go into investment banking or management consulting because they would fairly just not be accepted.
Correct. There's a book that I love called Pedigree by a sociologist named Lauren Rivera, and she studies hiring at investment banks and consulting management consultancies and elite law firms, and they basically won't hire anybody other than from the top 3 or 4 schools in the U.S. News and World Report rankings. There's a joke. One of the people jokes in her book that they don't even want to go to Stanford because it's too long of a flight.
Okay, yeah, not too many comments on that. And another question, Evan, that you raised is that you have talked about the changes of different jobs that graduates would go into, from law and medicine to investment banking and management consulting and tech jobs. And if we talk about the other numbers, if we talk about the tax exemptions, if we talk about the possibilities of people breaking in and out, has that at all changed over time, or is that something that has stayed more or less the same at Harvard and other elite universities?
In terms of the percentage of people that have gone into public interest jobs, it stayed steady over time. In terms of which particular sort of money-making careers they go into, that shifted. As I said, it used to be law and medicine, and now it's investment banking and management consulting. I think, you know, the thing I'd emphasize on this is it's changeable. It's a choice. So I talk in the book about Bates College and Bates's president, Clayton Spencer, whom I greatly admire, started a program when she became president called the Center for Purposeful Work. And about 15% of Bates kids go into teaching as a career. These things are shapeable. You know, one of the myths of elite colleges that elite colleges tell is that the students go into investment banking because that's what they want. But it's not true. There's a wonderful sociologist, Amy Binder, at the University of California, San Diego, and a big part of her life's work is interviewing people like this. And what she finds is that college students, smart college students, or, you know, elite college students are just like all college students. They don't really know what they want to do. Very, very few people, almost none, even know what it means to be an investment banker. Now, they're high achievers. They've spent a life, you know, jumping hurdles. And so they understand what status is. And that's the genius of Teach for America, the program I mentioned earlier, is they made it a status thing. And I am sure that with all of the smart people at Harvard and Yale and Princeton, that if they put their minds to how to steer rich kids into public service oriented careers, they could make a dent in the problem.
And how much do we need this brain power in particular now? At the very beginning of our conversation, we talked about the climate change, we talked about social injustice, not only in the US, but basically this is a global symptom we can see. And how much do you personally maybe believe that we would need this brain power to be used in order to find the challenges that we currently face as humanity or society?
Well, my answer is not going to surprise you, I think. We desperately need talented people interested in serving the public good. Now, look, this is somewhat of a subjective assessment. I just don't think the world needs that many more management consultants and investment bankers. That's my judgment of what challenges are facing humanity right now. We have a desperate need for people in public service to educate the next generation, because we know that college produces all kinds of benefits for people. It's not just about economic consequences. It's about their embracing of data and science and a diversity of opinions. And boy, we need scientists right now. So that's my assessment of what the world really needs. But I will say unequivocally that producing investment bankers and management consultings is not something that the American taxpayers should be subsidizing.
You've talked about the tax subsidies a few times by now, and maybe you can give us a little bit of numbers. What do different colleges really receive? Is that something they receive per student? And is that the same for each and every university? Or is that something they receive per university? Maybe you can give us a few details here, Evan.
Sure, they're receiving tax benefits in a number of ways. One, when their alumni contribute to endowments, those contributions are tax exempt. Two, the earnings on the endowments, which are substantial, and I could put some numbers on that for you, those are tax exempt. Three, almost all of them are exempt by local or state law from property and real estate taxes. And four, they receive tax benefits for the few socioeconomically disadvantaged students that they admit. And also many of these colleges are receiving lots of federal research funding. So obviously, I think research is a public good, but just to throw a number out there, Harvard and Stanford each get about $1 billion in federal research funding every year. So the taxpayers are paying for that too. I'll throw one number out at you. So, because I think it's very hard for people to have a sense of big numbers. So what does it mean in practical terms? So Harvard's endowment right now is $52 billion. And pretty much all of these colleges with massive endowments follow what's known in the business as the Yale model. They draw down about 4.5% of their endowment every year. So they are spending some of their endowment, but the endowments have continued to grow. And as I said earlier, Harvard's on track to cross $1 trillion in 2020. What would it look like if Harvard drew down 5.5% of its endowment every year instead of 4.5%? So that would be another $500 million, right? What could you do with $500 million? Well, the operating budget, my college's operating budget is about 200, Harvard's about 200. So you could run 2 colleges for that. Harvard hasn't, none of these colleges have expanded capacity in 50 years. Imagine Harvard opened up a campus in Detroit, just dedicated to providing opportunity for super smart people. You change America, you change that community. So these choices are massively consequential.
Thank you very much for making that much more tangible. And you said that those schools receive roughly $1 billion of tax benefits per year. And how much, just I don't know if there is numbers if we can compare that, but at City University, New York, how many tax benefits would you receive? Probably this is not really comparable yet because we talk different numbers of students.
Right.
But
It's not apples to apples. So the principal benefits, the principal tax benefits, so it's a collective $20 billion in annual benefits. This is the estimate to the elite colleges as a group. But the principal benefit that they're getting is tax exemption for endowment contributions and endowment earnings. My college has a 7 million with an M endowment. So, there's nothing to be tax exempt. Another kind of way of putting this into perspective, I attended our annual gala last year for John Jay, and we raised $1 million. And I sat in a room with the John Jay board of directors, and I was like, well, thank God that we did that. And that on that day, our best day of the year, we earned between a third and a sixth of what Harvard passively earned on its endowment. So our best day is worse than their worst day.
and those numbers will only grow on the elite college ends, right? As you said, those numbers accumulate.
So I think that's a really important point, right? Is how does this get better? And I talk about this stuff a lot. So I see what people like are very happy to embrace, and I see what's very challenging to people. So everybody's happy to hear me tell wonderful stories about the students that I've taught and the miracles that public colleges can do. They're not so happy for me to talk about the ceiling, the lowering of the ceiling. But, it's a zero-sum game to some extent. There's only 1% of people are going to be in the top 1%. And, if we're out there raising $1 million, but Harvard raised $10 million that day alone, well, then we still fell behind by $9 million. And for this to change, there's going to have to both be some raising of the floor and a lowering of the ceiling. And they're both very, very challenging because America has massively disinvested from public colleges, but the cap is a tough sell too.
It's again a double-edged sword, right? It goes into both directions. So yeah, I think that helps making that tangible. And Evan, you already touched ground on some stories or some success stories, I just want to call it. And maybe we can use 2 or 3 from your very book, because what I really liked reading the book was that there is very personal stories of people. And I have a few names here, but maybe you have names that come to mind that you would like to highlight here or that you would like to discuss.
Well, sure. I love all of the people who I represent in the book, and I love many of the students that I've taught. We were talking about career choices. There's a woman whose story I tell in the book, Crystal Salvati. She's in her 3rd year at University of Pennsylvania Law School. So that's a story that's gone really well. She's brilliant. And she grew up with nothing. Just overwhelming disadvantage. She's a public interest scholar at Penn Law. She's currently working at the Federal Public Defender's Office. She spent her first summer doing death penalty work. And, she's going to go and be a do-gooder. And basically everybody that I've taught is, I think they all understand kind of the unspoken agreement that we make when we're the beneficiaries of public education, that we need to give back in the same way that we've benefited. And it's heartwarming. I think my college doesn't just produce amazing success stories. I think we produce good people with a real commitment to social justice.
Which is something that, if I may be allowed for that comment, many of the elite colleges maybe do not do all the time, and giving back may or may not be the very priority of the students leaving their job for the job force, right? This is what we've discussed earlier. So I think you do a wonderful job there.
Thank you. I think we all feel it. It's whether you feel entitled or whether you feel humble. I certainly never felt entitled to be at Harvard. I was humbled in many ways. Despite my misgivings about it as a social actor, and there's significant misgivings, I revere education, and I was very grateful to be able to study there. But I think these qualities are taught. I think that humility comes to me from my parents, and I think it comes from a lifetime of teaching where I have, and I see the razor's edge that separates an easy, successful life from a life filled with obstacles.
No, this humbleness is definitely something worth learning from an early childhood on. And I have a few more questions on the education system in the US, a little bit broader, let's just call it. And I want to intro again with another quote from the book. And it says, "The United States maintains an apartheid educational system. To this point, elite colleges have received a pass for the central role they play. It's time for them to account." And my question is, Evan, do you think that the education system in the US is damaged, meaning it can be fixed, or is it rather broken, meaning it should be rebuilt?
Well, it's definitely broken. I mean, there are massive disparities of opportunity. And at the public school level, it's driven a lot by that Supreme Court case that I mentioned before, Milliken versus Bradley. It's just not possible to have equity and local control. I think everybody understands this. When the PTA at a high school in an affluent suburb raises $2 million for the school, well, that's great for those students, but everybody else is left behind. And the fair distribution of that money would be to give it equally to all schools in the area. That's just not possible in the United States. But among private colleges, I don't think perfect equity is achievable, but they could do so much better than they're doing. They have massive resources, and they've not questioned these fundamental assumptions of American higher education in decades. So it's just not obvious that Harvard needs 4 skiing teams. And I have nothing against skiing, but I'm looking at it as an avenue of social opportunity. And there is no poor kid who's going to make it onto the Harvard downhill skiing team. And I think Harvard, and there are a lot of choices like that, and all of these colleges could do it. They could afford to create pathways for a lot more socioeconomically disadvantaged students than they do.
There is an article, and probably those numbers are not new to you, in Forbes magazine, and it dates on the 15th of October 2021, so pretty much a year old. And it reads that the endowment returns at the Ivy League universities and numerous other elite colleges have soared to new heights this year. As of today, 6 of the 8 Ivy League schools have reported their returns for the just concluded fiscal year, and each has set records of one type or another. The average rate of endowment return for those 6 schools was 42%. So Harvard University saw a 33.6% return on investment, bringing the value of endowment to $53.2 billion, the largest in the nation, and an increase of 11.3% from the previous fiscal year. The endowment public equity asset saw a 50% return, while private equity generated a 77% return. So my question is, the elite colleges seem to be a very lucrative business, as we can get from those numbers. So who will interfere with this systematic segregation and growing inequality then?
Well, there are only 2 candidates. One is the college community, so that means students and faculty and alumni. And I hope my book is the start of putting some pressure on them to start to pressure the leadership of those institutions. And the second possibility is federal tax policy. And during Trump's presidency, they put a 1.6% excise tax on schools that had endowments in over a certain amount, and that money just disappeared. It would be so much better for the left to challenge universities and leverage federal tax benefits for socioeconomically disadvantaged students. So, before Harvard and Yale get their tax break, let's say to them, hey, you have to double the percentage of students are on Pell Grants, which is one federal program. So anyway, those are the two avenues for reform. I think actually they're both doable. I have some optimism about this, but we have to start to tell an honest narrative about what these schools are really doing.
And what would be the next steps other than educating people with your very book and being more honest about it? What is maybe first initiatives that you would like to see, or that you are also optimistic seeing at some point happening?
I'd like to, and I'm working with somebody to try to do this. So I appreciate that people feel loyalty to their alma mater, but I don't think that money should be given unconditionally. So I think there should be a vehicle if somebody's a graduate of Yale to say, sure, I'm going to give you $10,000 or $100,000 or whatever, but that's conditioned on you getting to a place where 30% of the students are Pell Grant recipients, or where we double the percentage of people coming from the lowest income quintile. That's doable.
Yeah, it sounds very doable. Is that realistic, though? Is that something that is being discussed in universities already?
Well, the university's not going to do it because they want their money, but I've been talking about it with a group of people, and I have some hope that we'll be able to do it. And you don't need to. If we succeeded in getting 1 in 10 graduates to say, hey, I'm only giving money conditioned on you meeting these conditions, they would take notice. It doesn't have to be everybody. We just have to start to hit them in their pocketbook a little bit.
That is one initiative. Is there, or are there other initiatives that come to mind that you would be very hopeful to see sometime soon?
Well, like I said, I think the federal tax break is in the crosshairs of Republicans. So Trump already did it very punitively, just as kind of a reflexive, rebuke of blue states and elites who didn't vote for him. But like I said, there have been some efforts from the left to really question the tax break or talk about how it can be leveraged. And I mean, I think in a variety of ways, I think a great rethinking of college and opportunity in America is happening. I thought at the Supreme Court arguments, it was very noticeable how many of the justices, Gorsuch and Thomas, both really focused on this, focused on ALDC preferences, those legacies for children, those admissions advantages for children of alumni and donors, and just how inherently contradictory it was for those colleges to say that they want to do race-based affirmative action for people of color while they're doing affirmative action for people of wealth.
And how fast do you believe we can hope for such a change in the education system in the US? Probably it's not something that will change overnight. Probably it will take a couple of years, if not decades. Do you want to give any projections here or any hopes, wishes?
Well, I'm a college professor, so I know that change in the academy is very slow. Virtually certainly, though, the Supreme Court is going to end race-based affirmative action before the end of this term. And that's going to spark a ton of change. Now, that may be retrenchment. It may just be that some of these colleges that diversity drops. And actually, sadly, I think that is what's going to happen for the less rich of the rich. But they are going to be forced to reckon with their way of doing business, to reconsider their way of doing business in in the very, very near future, because it's a certainty that race-based affirmative action is ending.
So at least some change is promising to come at some point. And Evan, again, like if you want, we could look into a couple of success stories or rather positive examples in the book if you want to do that. And otherwise, I would be interested talking about the book Poison Ivy, which you released a month ago, more or less, not even. Is there anything that we haven't talked about sufficiently and that you would like to share with the audience today?
Well, thank you for this conversation and for paying attention to the book so carefully. I think I appreciate that you talked about the stories of the students. I mean, I'm a writer, and I hope that the book is deeply affecting because of the stories that I tell. And I talk in the book about Brian Stevenson calls it proximity to suffering. And I frame it in the conclusion. The poet Robert Frost talks about knowing the midnight. And obviously everybody understands bubbles. We all talk about that. And thanks to social media, people live in factual or informational bubbles now, and then they live in residential bubbles. And so, if you live in a particular type of suburb in the United States, you're just never really going to encounter a poor person, or they might be a novelty item. And then, I've basically spent my entire career working around students of ordinary means, and I just don't think you could do that and be callous to their suffering, be indifferent to how hard they have to work to achieve what they achieve. And, my plea to your listeners is to get out of the bubble. And, I noticed that even at my own college, that when I talked to the members of our foundation, they gave some money, not that much, but, none of them taught. And I think when you start to, take your gloves off and get your hands a bit dirty, I just don't think you can help but be changed by the experience. And so I'm not even worried about like a particular ask. Just go adjunct, go teach a class at your local community college, and the rest will just flow naturally, because you'll understand that the story that we tell about poor people is wrong. And this is, if I had like a gut emotional thing that really drove me to write this book, it's that in America, at least, I'm guessing it's kind of true around the world, that the story that rich people tell is that poor people succeed because they're lazy and stupid, and the opposite is true.
No, definitely. And that definitely must be highlighted. And when you were talking about the different bubbles, Evan, also, maybe we can, because you use that example of yourself in that very book, I believe you indeed open up this book, that you live in one bubble and you work in another one, or you work in reality. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit to that, how much of an influence that maybe also have had. And in our pre-talk, you just mentioned that you even changed places, and that's where I'm gonna leave it.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. I mean, I've lived in all different types of communities. And I've lived in a lot of different places. But as I mentioned in the book, my wife and I settled in a reasonably affluent suburb where we lived for 9 years. We were like, the poorest people in the community. But I had enough money that we could make a down payment on our house. And my wife's a college professor too. And then we just barely got by, but, living an upper middle class lifestyle. And it was an overwhelmingly white community. My wife is not, and my children are not white. And it was really profoundly affecting to see the world through their eyes, and also to see the world through the eyes of the collective eyes of my neighbors. And I tell the story in the book also. We went to visit, I tried to find the opposite extreme. And it's this amazing community in Baltimore where the guy's name is Michael Sarbanes. His dad was a senator from Maryland. He had a very privileged life, but he basically lives in, it's almost like a commune or a kibbutz. And it's so moving. They're so involved with each other's lives and so committed to a collective vision of justice. And they're happy. That's what I think people lose in this, is the people that get on this merry-go-round of chasing status for their children and trying to prevent them from losing class standing. That race is never ending, and it's an unfillable void, and doesn't make you particularly happy. We live in a very diverse community now. It's very socioeconomically and racially diverse, and it's totally different. It's for me, but I think it would be for a lot more people than realize. I just think people don't question this fundamental assumption of what makes a life happy. What and I there's tons of data on this, but wealth doesn't do it by in and of itself.
No, I would definitely agree. And my old, let's just call it bubble, is investment bankers and management consulting. And I can tell you very clearly that most of these people are not walking their life being super happy, but that they are chasing more status, chasing more wealth. And some of them may get it, but most of them do it at the expense of the present moment for sure. And many of them do it at the expense of their happiness just as much.
I mean, I think if I understand your story where you stepped outside that bubble and are trying to understand some of the things that lead people to have more meaningful and happy lives. Well, first of all, you're in your own 1%. Most people never reach that. But I'm blessed. I mean, sometimes people ask me, what would you do if Harvard came and offered you a professorship? I wouldn't go. Because I figured that out. I have enough money. I'm not rich, but my kid goes to school and my kids are in college. My older kids are in college, and I love what I do. And I think if you live a life of ideas and a life that's committed to whatever your conception of justice is, it's satisfying in a way that money never could be.
Fully agree, Evan. Thank you so much for that. And I, in fact, have a few questions that I ask each and every podcast guests towards the end of the episode. But before we go there, Evan, if people want to know more about yourself, about this very book, about the other books that you have done, how can they engage with you and where can they find out more about yourself?
Sure. I mean, I'm easy to find. I'm on Twitter at Evan Mandery. I have a webpage, which is just www.evanmandery.com. And you can find my email address if you go to John Jay's website. And boy, if you're interested in engaging in a practical way with any of these ideas that you want to try to change your own alma mater, I welcome that conversation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Evan. And a question that I like to ask authors is, what are books that you like to gift recently other than your own?
Recent gifts. Well, I'm a lifelong voracious reader and a wide reader, so I have lots and lots of books that I love. What's a book that's been meaningful to me recently? A couple come to mind. I definitely went through an elaborate effort to try to understand what happened to America in 2016. So I read a lot of books trying to get my sense of what was going on. My favorite I'm sure you'll know him, or many of your listeners will, is Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind. And I actually went and taught, I teach an ethics class, which I love teaching, and I went and taught it at a right-leaning college, part to kind of my own sense of engaging with people. And that experience confirmed a lot of the things that Haidt believed. I like Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. I think when you read that book and kind of understand the flawed heuristic biases that people have, that you see what goes wrong for humanity. And so I've given those books a lot. I think the last book I read was Neil Stephenson's new climate change novel, which I really liked. I like sci-fi.
Thank you very much for that, Evan. And with that, I have 3 final questions for today's podcast episode. And the first one is, what is an important truth for you that most people don't know or talk about?
That the tail wags the dog doesn't wag the tail, that we're emotional beings at core, that we just have gut reactions to situations, and then we offer rationalizations to defend those gut positions that we have. And I think it would be better to be just much more honest about that. It's effectively pragmatism. It's basically, I'm saying what Dewey said, but that opened up a lot of pathways for me to realize that people, they don't reason deductively. They kind of induce their principles based on things that they've said to justify what they've said.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you very much, Evan. And
I'm glad it makes sense to you. I spend a lot of time in class talking about it, but I think people get it. I don't really think there are utilitarians or Kantians out in the world. I just think they just attach to ideas that justify things that they already believe. Sorry.
Good to have that discussion. And Evan, another question would be, whom are your mentors and whom do you look up to?
Well, I look up to my dad. My father, as I mentioned, has spent his lifetime in schools, and I romanticize the idea of the public school, the idea that we will educate anybody who walks through the doors of this place. And my dad always got it. My dad never cared what anybody looked like, or he just wanted to make them the best possible version of themselves. And I don't know how I judge people. I really just judge people by, are they nice to kids and nice to dogs and nice to waiters? And my dad always was. So that's the type of person that I've tried to be. And then there's a man. My biggest prior book is a book about 2 Supreme Court death penalty cases. There's a man there who worked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He's an amazing civil rights lawyer. His name is Michael Meltzner, and he's been wonderful to me. And it was a blessing to me that I got to. He's still alive, and I've gotten to know him and to be his friend. And I think if I could have been a lawyer for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I would have just done that for 50 years.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing those 2 very inspiring individuals with us today, Evan. And that leads me to the last and final question for today. And I call it the 3 truths. And it's a rather hypothetical question. So, Evan, I would like you to imagine that you're traveling in space all by yourself. And in fact, for quite some time. So it could be a couple of months, or it could be even be a couple of years. And after quite some solo travel, you encounter a human-like species. And they can only process 3 facts or 3 truths about humanity before they decide whether or not they want to get to know us. What do you tell them?
So I don't know if you know, maybe no reason you would know this, but 5 of my books are novels. And if you'd asked me my favorite writer, I would have said Vonnegut. And one of my books is called First Contact, and it's about aliens contacting Earth. And the plot of the novel is that this is back when, I was worried that George Bush was a poor president. The plot of the novel is that aliens contact Earth, and the U.S. president mistakenly concludes that they're Jewish, and he just screws up the whole interaction with them because the aliens ask them to have brunch, and he concludes from that somehow that that's their religion. So I've thought about stuff like this a lot. I have to say that I'm worried about humanity right now. I'm worried whether we can act in the collective interest. But I will answer your question. I'll try to give you what I think are the best things about myself and the people that I love. So if you ask me and my daughter what I'd want them to understand about us is our sense of humor, that we can find absurdity and comedy even in sorrowful situations. I think there is some that humor connects to, I think of it as a kind of deep music of the universe. I do think there is some kind of shared sense of justice in art that people have an intuitive sense of. I think they may learn to hate over the course of their life, but I do think at bottom they have that core goodness. I think I may have given you a 1, a 2, and a 2A, but that's what I most like about people. It's why I'll say this, and I'll make this my third. It's why I love kids. If I'm in a room with a whole bunch of adults and there's one kid there, I'll go over and I'll talk to the kid, and I'll always have a great conversation because they're funny and they're silly, and they like puns, and they like song parodies, and that's what human beings are at their heart, and then they're socialized in some problematic ways. I like that
Absolutely.
question.
Absolutely. I can definitely agree to that. And I suppose most of us could use a little bit more play and just being ourselves. I definitely do agree to that, Evan. Thank you very much. And if there is any last or final comments for the audience today, it's all yours.
Well, I hope if you're moved at all by this conversation or to read my book, or that you'll be moved to read my book. And then I do think graduates at these colleges, and no doubt many of your listeners are, they ultimately are communities of their students and alumni. And if you start demanding change, it won't happen overnight, but over time things will start to improve. So thank you for this.
Thank you so much, Evan, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
If you enjoy this podcast and learn from it, please feel free to share this episode with a friend or two, and make sure to subscribe to the Just Another Mindset podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please use the next 10 seconds to give the Just Another Mindset podcast a rating, and know that you will help me to create more meaningful content like this, and also that it will help other people to find this content and get inspired as well. If there is any future topic or guest that you would like to hear more about on the Just Another Mindset podcast, please let me know by leaving a comment on YouTube or sending a mail directly to contact@ishmaelwondergarten.com. And if nobody told you lately, be reminded that you are worthy, you matter, and you can achieve anything.
Do more of what makes you happy. Be yourself. Positive. Change. Just another mindset.